In the scorching heat of the American South, a black woman quietly walked into the Blue Ridge police station. Her faded t-shirt clung to her skin, her hair damp with sweat. She simply intended to ask for directions to the mayor's office. But after just a few steps, an officer approached her, eyes filled with disdain. Before she could say a word, he shouted loudly, then suddenly spit in her face, right in front of several colleagues. A few sneers echoed, but most just stood and watched. No one knew that this woman was not a lost stranger. And that very act would soon force everyone in the room into a stunned silence. Blue Ridge is a small town nestled deep in the American South. Surrounded by hills, winding narrow roads, and tall old trees that offer shade year-round, the place carries a strangely peaceful air. People here greet each other by name, know exactly who lives where, and it's nearly impossible to keep a secret for long. At the center of town stands the Blue Ridge Police Department. A modest two-story building painted light gray, with a tall flagpole out front. Locals often point to it and say, "That's the place that keeps order around here." For years, this station was seen as the model for law enforcement, neat, disciplined, with a reputation for being strict and by the book. But appearances can be deceiving. Lately, stories have started to leak out. In grocery stores, coffee shops, and barber shops, people whisper about being stopped for no reason, about suspicious stares, and half-said comments from a few officers at the station. Some believe they were questioned too much simply because they didn't look like they were from Blue Ridge. Others say they've walked past the station only to feel cold eyes watching from the windows. That morning, the sky was clear, and the sun burned bright. A woman appeared at the intersection near the town's edge, dragging a faded canvas bag behind her. She wore a loose, sun-bleached t-shirt, slightly torn jeans at the knees, and worn-out sneakers. No one paid her any mind. No one said hello. A few glanced her way, then looked away again, as if she didn't belong here. Her name was Jasmine. Slender build, calm, steady steps. Her skin was dark and sun-tanned, a sign of someone who had traveled far under the heat without stopping. Her eyes were deep, and she kept her head slightly bowed when passing others, as if trying not to attract attention. But her face was composed, even quietly unreadable. It wasn't fear. Nor was it hesitation. It was waiting. No one at the station knew her. The name Jasmine Morgan had never appeared in town bulletins, internal meetings, or any recent discussion. If anyone had ever seen her before, they wouldn't have remembered. She was too ordinary to stand out. Jasmine didn't enter through the main door. She chose the side entrance, the one fewer people noticed. As she stepped into the long hallway, she paused briefly near the notice board, glanced at it, and then moved on. No one greeted her. No one came up to ask if she needed help. If there were any glances, they were fleeting, then quickly averted. No one realized that the quiet woman was actually watching them, those who were unknowingly revealing their true selves. And in that very moment, what seemed to be the town's most stable place had begun to crack. Just a small fracture. But enough that, within a few hours, it would split wide open into an earthquake. At the far end of the ground floor hallway was a small break area. A few folding chairs, an old round wooden table, and a hot water dispenser that everyone in the station had used at least a few times per shift. 3 officers were gathered there, laughing loudly. Among them was Daniels, a seasoned lieutenant with more than 15 years of service in Blue Ridge. His laugh was the loudest, tinged with a hoarse edge of someone hardened by experience, but it also carried a smugness that couldn't be missed. Jasmine walked toward them. She didn't look at the group, simply headed straight to the water dispenser. Maybe she was tired. Or maybe just thirsty. Her hand reached out slowly, aiming for the communal plastic cup sitting next to the machine. But Daniel stood up. He stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path with his large frame. His face darkened, eyes narrowing, as if trying to figure out who this woman in front of him was. He asked, in a flat tone laced with suspicion, "You lost or something?" Jasmine smiled faintly, so light it was barely more than a press of the lips. She answered softly, politely, "I was just looking for directions to the main office." Before she could finish, Daniels cut her off. His voice rose, dripping with sarcasm, "This ain't no shelter, lady." The tone made the other two officers fall silent. One of them, a woman, smirked and pulled out her phone. No one asked her to, but she started recording the scene, as if expecting some kind of show with a punchline. Daniel stood tall, arms folded across his chest, scanning Jasmine from head to toe. His voice dropped lower, but grew colder. "This isn't a place for people like you." The words weren't accidental. They were chosen carefully. Every word, every look, delivered with intent, as if Jasmine wasn't a person, but something out of place. Something unwelcome. Jasmine said nothing. She just looked at him. Not angry, not defensive, not shaken. Her gaze was steady, almost cold. And it was that silence, calm, unwavering, that threw Daniels off balance. For a man used to control, to deference, being stared at by a stranger, a woman no less, and someone like her, with no sign of fear, was like a punch to the ego. And something inside Daniels began to crack. He was about to go further. Beyond words. And he didn't know it yet, but every second that passed was bringing him closer to the biggest mistake of his life. Jasmine's silence didn't make Daniel stop. On the contrary, it acted like an invisible shove, pushing him further into frustration. Without another word, Daniel suddenly stepped in close, face to face with her, and out of nowhere, spit directly onto Jasmine's left cheek. The act was swift, crude, and so unexpected that the whole room seemed to freeze for a split second. At least 5 officers were present. One of them burst out laughing, a loud, gleeful sound as if they had just witnessed an entertaining sideshow. Another shook his head, brows slightly furrowed, but he said nothing, didn't move, didn't intervene. No one spoke up. No one stepped in. They just stood there, as if what had happened was somehow within expectations. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her head turned slightly from the impact, but her eyes remained steady. She showed no anger, no outburst, didn't utter a single word. Calmly, she slipped a hand into her pocket, pulled out an old handkerchief, and began wiping the stain from her cheek. Her movement was slow, deliberate, only deepening the heaviness in the room. Like a cold silence settling after a bitter wind. She then asked, in a quiet voice laced with weight, "Do you usually do that to strangers?" It wasn't an accusation. Just a question, so simple, yet so unnervingly calm. Daniels shrugged, his eyes still burning with hostility. He replied in an icy tone, "I do that to people who don't belong here." Clearly, in his mind, Jasmine didn't deserve to exist in this space. Didn't deserve respect. Didn't deserve to be heard. Jasmine didn't answer. She folded the handkerchief, slipped it back into her pocket, then turned and walked away. Her steps were slow but firm. She didn't look back. Didn't glance at anyone. She walked toward the far end of the hallway, quiet, just like when she arrived. But this time, no one could pretend they hadn't seen her. Among the remaining officers, the youngest one lowered his head. His hand clenched slightly. He didn't dare look up. Maybe it was the first time he had witnessed something like this. Maybe he didn't agree with it, but he didn't have the courage to speak. The others. They kept laughing. Still whispering cruel jokes, still nudging each other like it was part of the morning's entertainment. As if spitting in someone's face was a normal thing to witness, as long as that someone wasn't one of them. What they didn't know was that, in that very moment, their silent complicity had erased a fragile line. And the price of that silence would not come cheap. Jasmine walked slowly down the hallway toward the main office. Her frame was small, quiet, her silhouette blending into the dull yellow light of the flickering fluorescent bulbs above. Though she didn't look back, she could feel the eyes behind her, sharp as needles piercing through the air. Laughter broke out. It started with a snicker, then quickly spread into louder chuckles. One voice rose above the others, purposefully louder than necessary, "She's probably looking for a place to sleep tonight." The sentence barely ended before the group burst into full laughter. It echoed down the corridor, sharp, bitter, like the screech of a chair dragged across cold tile. Jasmine kept walking. No reaction. No pause. But behind her, Daniels wasn't done. He leaned casually against a chair, hands in his pockets, his mouth curled in mockery. "Better lock up your stuff," he called out, half joking, half serious, "we've got a stranger wandering the station today." A few officers laughed louder at that. One gave the table a light slap in agreement, another threw his head back in laughter, without ever looking Jasmine's way. As if she didn't exist. Jasmine paused for just a brief second. She turned her head, not hurriedly, not with anger. Her eyes scanned the group behind her. Cold. Silent. Unflinching. Not accusing. Not wounded. Just a gaze that went straight through, as if peeling back the layers they had hoped no one would ever see. The group fell quiet for a few seconds. But no one said a word. Jasmine turned again and continued walking. That glance, however brief, was enough to dim the room's energy. In the far corner near the window, two young officers exchanged glances. One of them, hair still standing, his face younger than the rest, whispered softly, "Daniels is always like that." His voice was barely audible, like wind brushing past. It wasn't a protest, nor support, just quiet resignation. The other frowned slightly, lips pressed tight. It was clear he wasn't comfortable. But also clear he wouldn't speak up either. Nearby, a female officer stood leaning against a filing cabinet. She looked to be in her 40s, her eyes tired. She didn't laugh. She didn't join in. She just shook her head, barely, as if she had seen it all before. "That's going to come back and bite him," she muttered, soft enough only those close by could hear. But like every other time, no one stepped forward. No one spoke up. No hand reached out to stop Daniels. They chose silence. They turned their faces away, back to their cold coffee or unopened computer screens. A few smirked along. Others looked unsure, but stayed quiet. The group mentality began to seep into the room. It settled between the laughter, the avoiding eyes, the indifference disguised as casual disinterest. Deep down, each one of them knew something was wrong. But no one wanted to be the first to say it. No one wanted to be the outlier in a group that laughed together. And so, the wrong became routine. A habit sustained not by cruelty, but by the sheer number of people who chose not to see, not to hear, not to speak. In that moment, Jasmine remained the only one silent out of pride. The others stayed silent out of fear. And that difference would soon split the room into two very different worlds. Just a few minutes later, the intercom came on with its usual flat voice, "All personnel, please report to the main briefing room at 10 o'clock. Officers began packing up their paperwork, closing laptops, and grabbing their familiar coffee mugs. No one noticed that Jasmine had already gotten up. She walked around through the side entrance, quietly stepping into the meeting room ahead of everyone else. She didn't choose a seat in the middle. Instead, she sat at the back of the room, where few people paid attention. Her hand rested on a brown folder, a faded red seal still visible on its cover. Jasmine didn't look at anyone, nor did she seem uneasy. She sat upright, her eyes fixed on the empty space ahead. As if she was used to waiting in places that didn't feel like her own. The main door opened. Daniels walked in with his usual swagger, shoulders back, steps firm. 3 others came with him, including 2 who had been at the break area earlier. As soon as he spotted Jasmine, Daniels chuckled, then pointed directly at her without hesitation. His voice echoed across the wide room, "The girl from this morning here to learn the rules too." Light chuckles rippled through the room. Not loud, not overwhelming, but just enough to make Jasmine the focus. A few people turned to look at her, some openly, others more discreetly. Some laughed because they thought it was funny. Others laughed because they thought they were supposed to. Jasmine didn't lift her head. She gently bowed over the folder in front of her, fingertips brushing along the paper's edge, like a familiar habit. Her eyes stayed forward, calm, steady. She said nothing. She didn't need to. A young officer seated nearby, who likely hadn't seen Jasmine before, leaned over and whispered, "Are you an intern?" There was no malice in his tone, just curiosity. Jasmine turned to him and gave a faint smile. No confirmation. No denial. Just a smile, just enough to make him a little uncertain. Daniels wasn't finished. He raised an eyebrow, smirked, and added, "She probably thinks this is a community center, not a police station." His voice held the same tone as before, mocking, dominating, waiting for another round of laughs. A few scattered chuckles followed. But this time, they were uneven. One laughed, another glanced around. There was hesitation. Not everyone felt as comfortable as before. The room's energy began to shift, heavier, like something unspoken was about to happen. Jasmine remained seated. Still silent. She didn't turn toward Daniels. Didn't respond. The room seemed tilted to one side, but her silence sat like a rock in the middle of a rushing stream. Every joke, every laugh, began to fade into the space between them. And no one yet realized that it was her silence, quiet, unmoving, that was about to tear open everything they believed was in order. After a few minutes of clamor, the laughter that had filled the briefing room began to die down. Some officers had settled into their seats, while others continued chatting softly. Then the side door opened, and Captain Harris stepped up to the podium. He was a respected figure, his hair more than half silver, his deep and clear voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He spoke briefly, only tapping the table lightly to signal everyone to settle down. "We will begin this morning's meeting," he said, pausing for a moment. "But first, today is a special day. It is the day we introduce our new police chief, the one who will lead us into the next chapter. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Eyes that had been half asleep suddenly snapped to attention. People exchanged glances, some straightened in their seats, others looked around the room, as if searching for someone who seemed out of place. Daniels raised his eyebrows and tilted his head toward the main door, as if expecting someone to enter. But the door remained closed. No unfamiliar face appeared. The room fell into an unusual silence. At the back of the room, Jasmine remained seated. Her back was straight, her hands resting lightly on a folder. Then, very slowly, she stood up. Every movement was unhurried, unforced. She took the folder with her and stepped forward. The chair she left behind made a small sound as she moved, enough to make a few people turn their heads. Daniel saw her. His eyes briefly furrowed. A trace of confusion appeared on his brow, then shifted into suspicion. His furrowed brow seemed to be searching his memory. Something did not add up. A vague, unsettling feeling took hold. Then Harris spoke again. Without any roundabout or lowering his voice, he announced each word clearly. "May I introduce Mrs. Jasmine Morgan, the new police chief of Blue Ridge." The room fell silent. No more laughter, no more jokes. Every eye fixed on the woman who had just walked past them. Some stared with wide eyes. Some furrowed their brows in disbelief. A few quickly bowed their heads, as if Jasmine's gaze could read everything they had just thought. Daniel stood frozen. He uttered not a single word. His face turned noticeably pale, his throat dry, his eyes blinking rapidly. He did not sit down, nor did he step back. He just stood there, as if nailed to the spot. Jasmine stepped up to the podium. The light from the window shone obliquely on her face. Her expression remained unchanged, calm, and cool. She swept her eyes around the room, not missing a single person. No words were needed, yet everyone understood, she had seen everything. And they had all seen something they never expected. For a few brief seconds, no one dared to laugh. No one dared to whisper. No one retained their earlier nonchalant demeanor. The truth had just been named. And the most frightening thing was not that the woman they had just scorned was now their new leader, but that she had witnessed every look, every word, every sneer. Not a single detail was spared. Without waiting for applause, without needing an invitation, Jasmine placed the folder on the podium and opened it, page by page, as if she had prepared for this moment long ago. She raised her head, her gaze locked firmly on the people seated before her. Her voice rang out, clear, steady, and strangely calm. But behind that calm was a tightly restrained fury. "Maybe some of you think I don't know what happened this morning," she began, her eyes not leaving the group seated in the center. "Let me remind you. I walked in through the side door, stood by the water dispenser. I was mocked. Treated like a stray. Spat on. And laughed at like I was some morning entertainment. No one moved. No one even breathed loudly." Jasmine spoke slowly, but every word was like a blade slicing through pretense. "I don't need surveillance footage. I don't need a witness. Because I was there. I stood among you, not as your superior, but as a fellow human being." She turned her gaze to Daniels. No rage. Just direct, unwavering honesty. "When you spat on me," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "you didn't just insult me. You spat on the honor of this profession. On the trust the public places in us." Daniels looked drained of blood. His face pale, his hands slightly trembling on his thighs. He stammered, trying to speak. I didn't know, exactly," Jasmine cut in, not letting him finish. "That's the problem. You didn't feel the need to know. Because in your mind, there was no reason to respect me. You never considered I could be anyone, because to you, I was no one." The air in the room felt vacuumed. No more laughter. No more averted eyes. Only a suffocating silence. Every person heard her words clearly, as if each syllable was naming them in an invisible indictment. "From this moment forward," she declared, her tone sharpened, "any act of disrespect, belittling, or abuse of power will be dealt with, thoroughly. No exceptions. No second chances. And no one stands above the code." She didn't wait for nods of agreement. Didn't seek their approval. She turned to Captain Harris and gave a subtle nod. "Lieutenant Daniels," Harris stood up, voice firm and official, "you are hereby suspended pending an internal investigation. Effective immediately." Daniels lowered his head. No one looked at him. And no one looked at Jasmine either. But everyone in the room knew, from that moment on, the old order had been broken. And for those used to standing above others unchallenged, there was no way back. After the moment of silence, Jasmine didn't leave the podium. She stood tall, her gaze softening, as if she had just shed her armor to reveal another part of herself, vulnerable, yet resilient. "I started my career 20 years ago," Jasmine said slowly. "Back then, I worked the night shift on the dispatch line. No uniform, no authority. Just a headset and emergency calls at midnight." She paused for a beat, her eyes distant. "I was once yelled at for answering a call 2 seconds late. I been called names no one should ever hear in a professional setting. And someone once looked me in the eye and said I didn't have what it takes to survive in this field." Some faces in the room began to shift. No more defensive frowns. Only somber eyes, eyes of people beginning to realize that Jasmine's silence earlier wasn't weakness, but a discipline forged over years. "For me, rising through the ranks wasn't about glory. It was a journey to prove I could, no matter how many times I was pushed back," she said clearly, every word carrying weight though her tone remained calm. She scanned the room, her voice firmer now. "I didn't return to Blue Ridge to make friends. I came back to clean up the system. And I'm starting with those who thought they'd never be held accountable." The air in the room grew heavier. A few officers lowered their heads. Not out of guilt alone, but because, for the first time, they saw that they, too, were part of the problem. On the left side of the room, a young officer stood up. He didn't speak loudly, but his voice was clear. "I'm sorry, on behalf of myself. I saw it, and I did nothing." Jasmine looked at him for a moment, then nodded. She said nothing more. Because for her, an apology wasn't what mattered. She needed action. And that small moment, his standing up, his admission, was already a first step. "Finally," she said, "change doesn't start in meetings. It begins when we dare to look at our mistakes. To feel ashamed. And to choose to do better." Her voice wasn't harsh. But it struck like a mirror held up to the room. No one laughed. No one looked away. And in that very moment, true change had finally begun. After that morning's meeting, Jasmine got straight to work. She ordered a full review of all internal complaint files, especially those involving Daniels. A special task force was assembled. Old records, once tucked away in locked drawers, were now brought into the light. The results didn't surprise her. Daniels had been reported multiple times. Citizens had accused him of abuse of power. Fellow officers had quietly submitted reports about his unprofessional conduct, even comments offensive to gender and race. But all of it had been dismissed, glossed over with a few lines of explanation, then buried in silence. This time, Jasmine didn't allow that to happen. She made sure not a single file stayed hidden. Not one report was watered down. No excuse would be accepted to justify cover UPS. Just 1 week later, the decision was signed. Daniels was officially terminated. No negotiations. No graceful exit. His name was added to the statewide watch list, permanently barred from employment in any law enforcement unit across the state. But she didn't stop there. Jasmine launched a department-wide ethics retraining program for all officers. It wasn't mandatory, but her actions spoke louder than any order. She personally led the first session. More people showed up than expected. And the room was oddly quiet, a silence born not of fear, but of people genuinely beginning to listen. From the community, the response spread faster than she anticipated. Some called to say thank you. Others left handwritten notes at the front desk. The people of Blue Ridge, once used to indifferent stares, now felt a new kind of assurance: no one would be given special treatment anymore. And no one would be dismissed just because they didn't look like they were from around here. One late afternoon, as Jasmine was leaving the station, she stopped when someone called her name. It was an 8th grade girl. Her face was shy, but in her hands was a small bouquet of flowers. "I'm the one Officer Daniels yelled at the other day," she said softly, then held out the flowers. "Thank you for doing what no one else dared to do." Jasmine bent down and accepted the bouquet. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes shone with a quiet warmth. She said nothing. Because sometimes, a thank you doesn't need words. From that day on, no one questioned Jasmine's place anymore. Not because of her title. Not because of her authority. But because she had become a living symbol of something simple: integrity. A black woman. Someone who had once been dismissed. Now the person who brought justice to an entire system. Jasmine said, during a staff meeting at the end of the month, "The truth may be forgotten for a time. But it will be acknowledged, through action. Not words." And once again, the room fell silent. Not out of fear. But because they knew, this time, the change was real. There are things that seem small at first. A subtle insult. A dismissive glance. A spit that feels meaningless. But sometimes, it's these very actions that pull a long-hidden truth into the light. Not because the truth is too big, but because it's finally too loud to ignore. Jasmine didn't use authority to make herself heard. She didn't need grand speeches to assert her worth. What made people listen, what made them change, was her courage. The kind she held from the moment she chose silence, to the moment she stood at the podium. She didn't retaliate. She didn't name and shame out of anger. She simply told the truth. But she told it at the right time, and never backed down. Change doesn't come from titles. Not from status or impressive introductions. It begins with one simple act: facing what's wrong, instead of walking away. And having the courage to speak up, even when you're the only voice in the room. If you believe justice should come without privilege. If you believe respect shouldn't depend on skin color, gender, or background. If you believe the story deserves to be heard, then share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe to the channel, so we can keep spreading what's right. Because out there, somewhere, there are still people like Jasmine. They just need a chance. And someone willing to listen.